Silence, be upstanding in court. All persons who have anything to do before my lords the Queen's Justices of Oyer and Termina and General Gerald delivery for the jurisdiction of the Central Criminal Court, draw near and give your attendance. God save the Queen.
Members of the jury, the prisoner at the bar, Penguin Books Limited, is charged that on the 16th day of August last, it published an obscene article, to wit, a book entitled Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence.
When the clerk of the court read out that indictment in No. 1 Court at the Old Bailey on October the 20th, 1960, there began one of the most fascinating and occasionally hilarious obscenity trials ever heard in this country. In the dock were not only Lady Chatterley's Lover, one of the most discussed erotic novels of the century, but also two national monuments, its author, D.H. Lawrence, and the publisher, the highly reputable Penguin Books. At issue was the freedom of literature in Britain, and, according to one defense witness, the English soul itself. In a moment, you'll see a dramatized version of the trial taken entirely from the official transcript, and, of course, very much shortened because the actual hearings lasted 6 days. First, though, a little of the background.
D.H. Lawrence was no stranger to prosecution. As early as 1915, a case was brought before a Bow Street magistrate against his erotic novel, The Rainbow. The magistrate ordered the publisher's Methuen to burn all existing copies. Then, in 1929, the year before his death, 13 of Lawrence's paintings, which showed pubic hair, were seized while on exhibit at the Warren Galleries in London. It was hardly surprising then that on completing the first version of Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1927, Lawrence wrote, "I've done my novel. I like it, but it's so improper according to the poor conventional fools that it'll never be printed, and I will not cut it." Far from cutting it, he rewrote it twice and expanded it, and it was the third version that he finally had printed at his own expense in Florence in 1928. After his death, his widow Frida authorized the definitive English version published by Odyssey Press in Paris. But to most English readers, only the heavily expurgated version was available. Lady Chatterley's Lover was the last of Lawrence's novels and had been written after a motoring trip to his native Nottinghamshire in 1925, which had revived his passionate hatred of all the ugliness brought about by industrialization. In the book, he imagines a world where exists a new, purely physical tenderness, what he called phallic tenderness, between man and woman. Connie Chatterley deserts her intellectual husband Sir Clifford, first for their guest, the Irish playwright Michaelis, but more enduringly for their gamekeeper, Oliver Mellors.
The book's notoriety stemmed from the frequent use of four-letter words, and from the detailed description of the sexual couplings between Mellors and Lady Chatterley. The American lawyer who successfully defended the book in a New York trial in 1959 said of it, "Lady Chatterley's Lover presents the forbidden acts in forbidden detail and describes them in forbidden language." In the 1950s, the concern of the literary world about the number of reputable books which were being prosecuted led to the Society of Authors and the Publishers Association forming a law reform committee. Its chairman was Sir Alan Herbert, and among its members were Norman St. John Stevens and Roy Jenkins. They produced a draft bill which was steered by Roy Jenkins and Lord Lambton through the Commons and subsequently became the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. Parliament had now accepted for the first time that although a book might be obscene, that is, it might tend to deprave and corrupt, its publication could nevertheless be justified on the grounds that it was in the interests of science, literature, art, or learning. As a result, expert witnesses could be called to prove or disprove that the work was for the public good. Encouraged by the change in the law, and also no doubt by the acquittal of the American publishers, Sir Alan Lane, the chairman of Penguin Books, decided to test the new act. He announced his intention to complete his Lawrence list by publishing at 3 shillings and 6pence the unexpurgated edition, which no British publisher had dared to print for over 30 years. Well, as the Act was designed to protect literature, yet give the police sufficient scope to prosecute pornographers, here was the ideal book with which to test it. When the Director of Public Prosecutions decided to prosecute, Penguin solicitors reminded the police that publication in law could be a mere giving of the book by one person to another and needn't involve an innocent bookseller. So Detective Inspector Charles Monaghan called at the Penguin office and solemnly received 12 copies of this book. And so on October the 20th, 1960, the crowded No. 1 court at the Old Bailey rose to the entrance of Mr. Justice Byrne. Mr. Gerald Gardner for the defence, now Lord Gardner, was assisted by Mr. Jeremy Hutchinson, now Lord Hutchinson. And appearing for the Crown was Senior Treasury Counsel, the late Mervyn Griffith-Jones. The prosecution found no witnesses of any standing prepared to say that Lawrence's book was not of literary merit. Gerald Gardner objected to 2 jurors, and then the 9 men and 3 women were sworn in and the indictment read.
Members of the jury, the prisoner at the bar, Penguin Books Limited, is charged that on the 16th day of August last, it published an obscene article, to wit, a book entitled Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. To this indictment, it has pleaded not guilty, and it is your charge to say, having heard the evidence, whether it be guilty or not.
The dock is empty, apart from a prison officer. The prisoner at the bar is Penguin Books itself, whose managing director, Sir Alan Lane, sits quietly at the solicitor's table.
Members of the jury, we start in my lady's boudoir in her husband's house. We go to the floor of a hut in the forest with a blanket laid down as a bed. We see them do it again in the undergrowth amongst the shrubbery and the pouring rain, both of them stark naked and dripping with raindrops. We see them in the gamekeeper's cottage, on the hearthrug, in bed and